Al Capone is the most famous gangster in history. It became the prototype for many Mafia films. At the same time, in reality the career of the famous mafioso was not as brilliant as shown in the movies and certainly not as long. Capone lived only 48 years. At the same time, he seemed behind bars at 30 years old. After several years spent in prison, he was already a complete wreck. Al Capone's brain was destroyed by syphilis and he had to be released early because he required constant care. The last years of his life, Al Capone was a pitiful sight. At times he fell into unconsciousness and talked with people whom he himself had killed. According to the psychiatrist, his intelligence corresponded to the mind of a 12-year-old child. Alfonso Gabriele Capone was born in 1899 in Brooklyn, New York. The parents of the future gangster, Gabriel and Teresa Capone, were from Italy, the small commune of Angra located near Naples. In 1893, the Capone family moved to America in search of a better life. At that time, the couple already had 2 small children, and Teresa was pregnant with her third. In total, 9 children were born to the Capone family. 1 child died at the age of 1. Capone's parents were practicing Catholics and earned their living by honest labor. Gabriel was a hairdresser and Teresa was a dressmaker. But despite this, all their children will become criminals. With the exception of perhaps the eldest son, James Wenchins, however, in his biography there are quite a lot of white 5. Upon arriving in New York, the Capone family settled at 95 Nueva Street. It was a dysfunctional suburb of Brooklyn near the naval shipyards, where crime flourished. They lived poorly, barely making ends meet. The family managed to change their apartment and move to another area only when Alphonse was 11 years old. Alphonse Capone spent his childhood on the streets of New York, like most children of poor people and immigrants. But hardly anyone could have imagined then that an ordinary hooligan from Brooklyn would become the head of a huge criminal empire. Alfonso was even considered a capable child. He did well in his parish Catholic school, but had behavior problems. When Alphonse was 14 years old, he was expelled from school because he allowed himself to hit a teacher in the face. As a teenager, Capone tried to earn an honest living at the ammunition factory in the candy store. Well, it didn't last long. At first, the Capones associated themselves with small criminal groups. And later he fell under the influence of the powerful gang of Giovanni Torrio. Torrio or Papa John was the head of a gang of extortionists and owners of an illegal gambling business called 5 Points. This man became the godfather and guide of Alphonse Capone into the criminal world. Capone began his career in the criminal world with a humble position as a bouncer. Torrio placed his protégé in Frankie Yale's Harvard Inn Billiards Club. The colorful teenager Alphonse was just right for this position. In fact, this establishment served as a cover place for Frankie Yale's gang. The gang's real activities were illegal gambling and racketeering. Alphonse, or Al, as he began to call himself in the American manner, did his job with pleasure. During this period of his life, Capone received his famous scar on his face. He got into a fight with a certain criminal named Frank Galacciu. According to legend, the quarrel occurred over his sister, according to other sources, over Galacciu's wife. To which Capone made an indecent compliment. Galacciu, trying to defend his sister's part, slashed Alphonse twice in the face with a knife, leaving him with a scar on his left cheek. Because of this special sign, Capone's later received nicknames for Scarface. Capone himself was ashamed of this story and tried to hide the scar, masking it with cream and taking pictures so that it was not visible. He said that he received the scar due to a slight wound in the war, although in fact Capone, of course, never served in the army. In addition to working as a bouncer at the club, Capone runs small errands for his boss Torrio. Gradually, the orders become not so small. In any case, by 17, the New York police were already closely interested in Capone. He was suspected of involvement in at least 2 murders. In 1918, Capone married May Josephine Coughlin, an Irish-American Catholic who was 2 years older than him. Al Capone was 19 years old at that time, that is, according to American laws, he was still a minor. Capone had to ask for written consent from his parents for the marriage. At the same time, both spouses changed their age on the marriage certificate by 1 year, as if they were both 20 years old. 3 weeks before their wedding, their first and only child, Albert Francis, or Sonny, was born. The child's godfather was Giovanni Torrio. The family's marriage lasted a lifetime, although she was far from the only woman in Capone's life. Like most bandits, Capone's did not disdain to resort to the services of prostitutes. Even before the wedding, Capone infected the bride with syphilis. Their son Albert was born with a congenital infection. He underwent forced brain surgery and remained partially deaf for the rest of his life. Moreover, Albert was the only child of Alia and May. Her subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriages and stillbirths. In 1919, at the invitation of Johnny's dad, Capone moved to Chicago. By that time, Torrio had already built a large business empire in Chicago, which was based on illegal casinos, brothels, and drug trafficking. At the end of 1919, America adopted the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which revoked the license of all private companies to produce, sell, and supply alcohol. The ban received broad public support. Large businessmen also turned out to be its supporters, because they needed efficient, disciplined, and most importantly sober workers. A few years later, alcohol consumption in the country was halved. Prohibition came into force in January 1920. Not everyone was satisfied with the new order. Lovers of strong drinks created a demand for illegal alcohol, and when there is demand, supply is also formed. The entire alcohol market simply moved underground and became a gold mine for gangsters. The alcohol produced underground was far from the best quality. It was prepared from cheap alcohol and juniper oil, and to make the moonshine look like whiskey, it was often tinted with iodine. By the way, the word bootlegger itself came from two words, boot and leg, since alcohol was often hidden in the top of the boot. Giovanni Torrio, even before the laws came into force, focused his activities precisely in this direction. Alcohol smuggling was right. Alfonso Capone, in turn, quickly moved up the career ladder in the Torrio gang. In Chicago, as in New York, he began as a bouncer, combining it with the position of a club barker and a pimp. But pretty quickly he became the right hand of the boss himself, the great and terrible Dad Johnny. Capone raided all Chicago establishments. Let's understand who's boss in the city. Soon, entire areas of Chicago turned into feudal appanages for the new alcohol baron, Papa John. There were fewer and fewer people who did not want to adapt. If they didn't come to their senses, they were destroyed. In 1923, Al Capone bought a house in Chicago for $5,500. He moved his entire family from Brooklyn to this house. Except for his father, he was no longer alive. By Chicago standards the house was small. Well, for the Capone family this place seemed like paradise. At first they thought that Alfonso had achieved success in America. According to the tradition of Naples, the whole family settled under one roof, distributed across floors. The top floor was occupied by Teresa Capone's mother. Al lived on the first floor at the back of the house with his wife May and son. Torrio's affairs quickly went uphill. However, competition in the bootlegging business was fierce. After a few years of prohibition, there was a clash between two mafia gangs. Italian led by Torrio and Irish led by Deacon Beanon. As a result, the latter was killed. Attempts began on Torrio himself. After another shootout, Papa John was seriously wounded. After recovery, he announced that he was retiring and leaving for Italy. He hands over the reins to his closest assistant, Alfonso Capone. So, 26-year-old Capone became the head of the largest criminal organization. Outwardly, Al Capone spent his entire life trying to maintain the image of a respectable businessman and active member of society. Unlike his mentor Torrio, Capone was not afraid of publicity. On the contrary, he made friends with the press, of course with the help of cash, so as not to leave a trace. The press portrayed Capone as a kind of Robin Hood who gave ordinary Americans what they needed. And in the 20s, people really needed a drink. Al Capone did not hide his luxurious lifestyle. The gangster placed his headquarters in a luxurious room at the Metropolis Hotel in the heart of Chicago. He did not skimp on tailored suits, cigars, jewelry, and other attributes of success. Of course, Capone never neglected caution. He traveled in an armored Cadillac and appeared everywhere, accompanied by security. Formally, Capone was a law-abiding businessman. His business card read furniture dealer. Another area of his activity was a network of laundries. It is believed that it was thanks to Capone that the phrase money laundering appeared. In addition, Capone was involved in charity work. He owned a network of canteens that fed all low-income citizens. Capone's true face was different. He was a much tougher leader than his mentor Torrio. The syphilis infection led to neurological problems, and Capone increasingly experienced outbursts of uncontrollable anger. In addition to bootlegging, gambling and pimping, Al Capone was involved in racketeering. Entrepreneurs were forced to pay under threat of reprisals. Shops were set on fire and their owners were beaten or doused with acid. There were also demonstrative murders, and several racketeering divisions were created, in which iron discipline reigned. Another profitable area was the control of prostitution. Capone did nothing with his own hands. He was at the head of a well-functioning hierarchical system. The police collected a file on Al Capone from the very beginning of his career, but did not take any action. The godfather of the Mafia regularly paid law enforcement agencies, judges, and local administration, so there were no conflicts. The mafioso emphasized in every possible way the power of his group. Thus, huge sums were spent on the funerals of those killed in skirmishes and fights. Coffins cost $15,000 and hundreds of bouquets. The ceremony was even larger than during the farewell to statesmen. Despite the fact that the Capone gang killed hundreds of rivals and lawmen, he continued to be a respected figure in the eyes of the public. He received bundles of letters from fans. Perhaps this would have continued further. It is possible that Capone had his sights set on politics. But everything changed in 1929. The Cold War between the Italian and Irish mafia gangs continued unabated. Now, the Irish were led by bottler Bucks Moran, who had been in prison 3 times. Soon Moran's group became so numerous that it began to threaten Al Capone's business. Moran crossed Capone's path back in September 1926. He tried to kill the Italian while he was peacefully dining in a restaurant. However, the operation failed. Moran thereby signed his own death warrant. On February 14, 1929, Moran's men were lured to a warehouse located north of Chicago. The operation was developed by Al Capone's closest associate, Jack McGorn, nicknamed the Machine Gunner. He invited Moran's people to a warehouse where trucks of alcohol were allegedly waiting for them, for which there was no buyer. The bandits took the bait and arrived at the scene. Meanwhile, Al Capone's men, dressed in police uniforms, brought a police car. They entered the warehouse, ordered the men to drop their weapons and line up against the wall. They obeyed the order of the police. Shots were fired. 7 people died in the Valentine's Day massacre. It was not possible to prove Al Capone's involvement in the massacre. Moreover, no one appeared in court at all. Capone provided himself with an alibi. On the morning of February 14, the bandit allegedly talked with a prosecutor in the state of Florida. The machine gunner also escaped responsibility. He stated that he was with his wife. Journalists immediately dubbed the girl a blonde alibi. By the way, the machine gunner died on February 14, 1936, exactly 7 years after these events. According to one version, he was killed by order of Moran. The Valentine's Day massacre was widely covered in the press, and published photographs from the crime scene shocked the public. Capone's popularity played a cruel joke on him, and not a trace remained of his reputation as Robin Hood. The public was outraged and demanded that federal authorities investigate Al Capone. President Herbert Hoover himself became interested in the circumstances of the murder in Chicago, and ordered all intelligence agencies to closely deal with Al Capone. "I want this guy to go to jail." This phrase from the president addressed to Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon played the role of a trigger. Capone's trial ended on October 18, 1931. He went down in history as one of the loudest in the world. America's biggest gangster did not receive such a long sentence, only 11 years in prison and a fine. The highlight of the process was that it turned out to be impossible to imprison Capone for numerous murders and bloody massacres. The prosecution simply had no evidence. The only way to put Capone behind bars was banal tax evasion. To do this, the tax service only needed to compare official income and expenses. If expenses far exceeded income, the question arose where the money came from. In Capone's time, it was not obvious that a person could be sent to prison for not paying taxes. But it turned out that it is possible. The ring around Al Capone gradually began to shrink. In April 1930, Capone was arrested on charges of vagrancy. The fact is that Capone managed his affairs so skillfully that all the real estate was registered in the name of his relatives, mainly his mother and wife. But Capone had nothing. However, a few days later, Capone was acquitted and released. Tax police officer Elliot Ness and his people began investigating the Capone case. For their incorruptibility, the team received the nickname Untouchable. They conducted a thorough investigation into whether Capone was actually ill when he refused to appear in court to testify. It was not difficult to detect the simulation. Bedridden Capone allowed himself to attend horse races in Miami and wander to the Bahamas. Contempt of court is a serious offense in the United States. After many delays and postponements of the hearing, Capone finally appeared to testify. He was immediately arrested right in the courtroom. The king of the gangsters faced a year in prison and a fine of $1,000, but in the end the judge released Capone on bail. But this was only the first warning. Another arrest soon followed, again over a trifle. Capone, along with his bodyguards, was detained for carrying unregistered weapons. This time Capone ended up in prison. He served only 9 months, after which he was released for good behavior. However, there is a version that this arrest was completely planned by Capone himself in order to lie low for a while and allow his opponent to let off steam. This seems to be true, because Capone was extremely careful and never carried a weapon himself. When Capone was released, the newspapers published a list of public enemies compiled by the head of the Chicago Criminal Justice Commission, and this list, as you might guess, opened with a familiar surname. In addition, Elliot Ness's people carried out several successful raids on secret salons, causing damage to the gangster empire of several $100,000. And besides, Ness discovered such traces of 2 accountants who handled all of Capone's financial affairs. They agreed to cooperate with the investigation. On June 16, 1931, Al Capone was accused of tax evasion and prohibition violations. He was facing 30 years in prison, and lawyers persuaded Capone to make a deal with the prosecutor's office. He agreed and managed to boast to journalists that in exchange for admitting guilt, he was promised a minimum sentence, from 2 to 5 years. However, Judge James Wilkerson unexpectedly announced that, although he was familiar with the recommendations of the prosecutor's office, he himself had no obligations to the defendant, and considered it impossible to bargain with the federal court. Stunned, Capone was forced to change his line of defense and declared his innocence. After this, a 4-month trial began, during which Capone's remaining free men tried to bribe almost every one of the jurors. Ness became aware of this. He reported everything to Judge Wilkerson. The trial, to which the leading media sent their best reporters, began again with a sensational statement from the judge. He said that another case was being heard in the next room at the same time, after which he ordered the bailiff to make an unprecedented exchange. Completely swap the entire jury of the two halls. Capone's defense and himself were shocked by the judge's decision. No one had time to bribe the new jurors, and the entire carefully developed plan went downhill. On the evening of Friday, October 17, 1931, the jury, after 2 hours of deliberation, returned a verdict of guilty on several counts of tax evasion. And the next day, the judge sentenced Capone to 11 years in federal prison and a fine of $50,000. And besides, for reimbursement of legal costs and return to the Treasury, $215,000 of unpaid taxes with interest accrued on this amount. In May 1932, Capone was sent to prison in Atlanta. At that time he was 33 years old. There he was diagnosed with syphilis and gonorrhea. Syphilis has several stages. At first, the patient develops ulcers. On the second, a rash may also cause flu-like symptoms. In rare patients, the disease can return with renewed vigor, decades later, causing fatal neurosyphilis. This is exactly what happened to Al Capone. In addition, he was experiencing withdrawal symptoms due to his cocaine addiction. Cocaine use led to a perforation of his nasal septum. There are different versions of how Capone's prison years went. According to one version, he sat in a luxuriously equipped individual cell and even slept on a mattress brought from home. And from his prison cell he even tried to continue running his gang. Until he was transferred to Alcatraz. According to another version, Capone ended up in prison completely broken. He could not cope with the bullying from other prisoners. According to the testimony of his cellmate and defenders in prison, Rita Rudensky, Capone was constantly on the verge of a nervous breakdown. That is why the Capones were transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz. Built to house America's most dangerous criminals. But here, too, the former Mafia boss survived an attack by a prisoner with a sharpener. Medical assistance from prison staff was not provided properly. And as a result, his illness only worsened. Ulcers appeared on his face, and Capone himself began to limp. One way or another, Capone's condition grew worse in Alcatraz. Neurosyphilis destroyed the brain, Capone was partially paralyzed. In 1939, he was transferred from Alcatraz to a federal correctional facility in California. And in the same year he was released on parole after an appeal by his wife May. So, in conclusion, Al Capone tried only 7.5 years instead of 11 years. Immediately after his release, the ex-gangster underwent brain surgery. But this only delayed the inevitable end for several years. Returning to Chicago and leading his empire was out of the question. Capone quickly fell into childhood. In 1946, his Baltimore psychiatrists conducted an examination and came to the conclusion that Capone had the psyche and mind of a 12-year-old child. On January 21, 1947, Capone suffered a stroke from which he died. But a few days later Capone died of heart failure. The Mafia boss was buried in Chicago, but due to the huge flow of tourists, which actually turned into a pilgrimage, his body was reburied in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Illinois.